the artists for making this happen, for being great sports, and again, pivoting, because the show, for the majority of the show's duration, has been closed, unfortunately. So this is one way we could connect and discuss the amazing work virtually that has been produced for the show. It's a depressing time for many of us, but especially a very depressing time for all of us who have worked on the show. I do want to thank the staff at the Municipal Art Gallery, including Jamie, who put this together, DCA in general, as Department of Cultural Affairs, as we struggle through these COVID times. There's the specter of cuts for much of the arts, not even the specter, it's happening right now. So I do want to thank all those of you who are working in the arts, and those who work for arts institutions, including all the artists. And lastly, I want to thank the foundation board for supporting what we do here, including some of our programming. So the show, To View a Plastic Flower, I'm the curator, by the way, I'm Steve Wong. I'm one of the curators at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery. And I had been working on the show with the artists for many, many months, going back to 2019. And what I was thinking, and what the artists are exploring, are the optics of conflict, interconnectivity, and perspectivism through media. And so the artists that we are here present today, that many of you who know, are Abigail Collins, and she presented 4 channels of her Out of Play series. I do hope to see it installed in the future with more videos. We have Samira, Yamin, who her series in the gallery, and she'll be talking about refractions, passing obliquely from one medium to the other, but mainly discussing her series refractions. And then Tran with her video installation, movements, battles, and solidarity. I think it's important to discuss these things, and one reason that I brought these artists together was to really question how we see and what we see, and how we acquire knowledge, and how that knowledge is transmitted. And I think what's really important, especially now during our COVID crisis, but even before, is looking at the interconnectivity of all of these things, and of how we are interconnected, how media oftentimes frames the way we look at these things, but also kind of weaves that thread that connects all of us to certain world events. And the title of the show, which I've mentioned before, which I just really want to reference, was inspired by TRIPTYCH Han, and really thinking about how nothing can exist in isolation, and how everything has to be interbeing with everything else. And I thought this was really relevant at the beginning of 2020, when the United States had launched missiles into Iraq, killing or assassinating an Iranian military official, and how everything that happens that seems a world away really affects everyone here in the United States, and how we question then what is our, how are we implicated in these decisions that our military are making and doing all around the world. But I think what is important and to discuss now in the context of COVID is that interconnectivity, how someone in another state could be protesting in public without any social distancing, how that could impact all of our lives today. So that's just a general framing, and kind of a newer framing, I think, that is important and relevant to some of this discussion today. So I don't want to take too much time. You all are here to hear from our artists, and why don't I pass the baton, and I think each of the artists will take, I think, 7 to 10 minutes to discuss their works in the show, but we'll start off with Tran. So Tran, are you ready?
I'm here. Yeah, I'm ready. Thanks,
okay.
Steve.
Great.
Yeah, thanks to all the staff and everyone at the gallery, and thank you all for joining us. So let me just share screen here. Hopefully you can all see that just fine. So I hope you'll be able to check out the videos from the piece. It's a simulated 3-screen video shared on the LA Municipal Art Gallery's website if you haven't already. It obviously would be better in person, but at least you'll have a simulated view of the a little bit less than 7-minute project. So today I'm going to talk about the piece in the show, and I consider it to be having 2 conversations with history, one socio-political and the other filmic. And it all started with this book that I read in 2016. And it's a book about a fashion show that paired 5 American designers with 5 French ones in order to raise money for the restoration of the Palace of Versailles. And it took place November 28th in 1973. So this was a very revolutionary moment in American fashion, because before that, American designers were typically copying French styles. And after this, they really put themselves on the map. And this came about through ready-to-wear, which interestingly enough, as an economic model, really saved haute couture, because before then it was sort of like, you know, on its deathbed, if you will. So with ready-to-wear and a race-conscious models of diverse race and ethnicity, this was the civil rights moment in America as well. So that was reflected in the show. And also disco providing sort of the energy, the vibe for the show itself. And by all accounts, the American won this Battle of Versailles against the French. So the first screen dealt with, so there are 3 screens in the project. The first dealt with this fashion show. And each of the screens have handmade elements on them as well. So this first one has hand embroidered the full life-size figure. She is 5'10" of Billy Blair, and by all accounts was the star of this show. So the first screen has this life-size embroidery on it, and she takes on this character that would conjure up subsequent models that would come to life on the runway. And it took 3 women, a duration of 6 weeks of work in Vietnam to hand embroider this work. So the images that you see here, the first one, they're working on a previous project by the Propeller Group. Second image is another past work of theirs. And just to kind of show you the fine details of the threading that they could do. So it really looks more like a painting than an embroidery. And then the last 2 images are sort of progress image for the Billy Blair embroidery for the work. And then going from that to the height of being clothed to sort of the depth of beyond being naked, right? And thinking about the iconic image that you see here of the quote unquote napalm girl. So this was an event that was captured by photojournalist Nick Ut, and it was the American dropping of a napalm bomb on this small village in Vietnam on June 8th, 1972. And thinking about, you know, a year apart, halfway around the world, the difference, but also potentially the similarity in the movements of these bodies of the 9-year-old girl, as well as the models on the catwalk. And then this particular book was influential in my thinking about war capitalism, and the book addresses that term in talking specifically about how Britain used war as a mechanism in order to corner the global cotton trade in the 19th century. And not directly, but I'm also curious and wondering and asking whether or not the Vietnam War could be a modern instance of war capitalism that, you know, have some residual or side effects benefiting fast fashion. And so the handmade element on this particular screen is that I drew an outline of the iconic image, and then used the hot knife to cut through the fabric to sort of reflect the singed skins of the children. And then I also wanted to counterbalance that with experiences of other females during the war. And so you'll have in the audio voices from HANOI Hana, the CBC band, which was known as the Vietnamese Beatles, who did a lot of Western rock covers, but also their own original scores and songs as well. And then also footage and songs from female Viet Cong fighters, soldiers during the war. And then the third screen, I was thinking then, well, who enabled American fashion, right? So looking at garment workers who were and are predominantly women. And in particular, during the years of 1972 and 74, there were 3 wildcat garment workers strikes that I focused on. One in El Paso, Texas, against the Farrah Pants Manufacturing Company by mostly Chicanas. And then the African-American workers, again, predominantly women, in Andrews, South Carolina at the Juanita Name Mills. And then lastly, the Chinese-American workers in San Francisco against the Junsai Company, which was a subsidiary of Esprit de Corps factory. And so looking, again, trying to see the similarities in the movements of the striking workers, the girl running down the street, and as well as the models on the catwalk runway. Interspersed throughout these 3 screens, I have images of Edward Muybridge's female models. And Muybridge was famous for his motion studies. And I'm also wanting to have a conversation with that motion study. So that's my second conversation with history. It's a filmic history about what are the similarities and differences in their physical movements, but also political, cultural, and economic movements as well. So that is my project, and I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can move on to Abigail. Oh, sorry, or is it Samira? Sorry,
I
Samira.
think we're going to go to Samira and then, yeah.
I think I'm going next, so if you just give me a moment, I will. Sorry. Oh, it's not allowing me. I'm so sorry to be doing this. Do I have permissions?
Yeah, you should. Let me. Okay, why don't you try it now? There we go.
That. Can you see that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. My apologies. Thank you. Thanks all for organizing this, and Steve especially for organizing this show and curating it, and giving us the opportunity to see all these works alongside one another, because I think there's a lot of overlaps, and I think all of the projects expand on one another, and so it gives us new things to see, and it's given me new things to see in my own work, and so I really appreciate that. And so the installation that I'll be talking about, which was my work, is on the left here from Tran's work. But just briefly, I wanted to point to my past work of about 10 years, which was hand-cut pages from Time magazine. And these are works that are, they're pages that are taken directly from the magazine. So the scale is the sort of 8x10 of the magazine, and I hand cut the patterns directly into the pages in a way to kind of think about and reveal the structure and the structure of representation, and how the representation of the Middle East, a nebulous Middle East, is constructed as a place of perpetual war. And to see how those images and the text combine and things like that. And so for the, but this project is the Refraction series. And what I was thinking about in this, for this body of work was after, 8 or 9 years of working on the Geometry series and thinking about the construction of this narrative, and the sort of degree to which photography is a construction, and the ways that that construction operates, I started to wonder that, if we know this, then what do we do? If we take for granted the construction, then do we not look at photographs? Because the photographs still exist. And I don't think not looking is the answer. So I started to think instead, how does one look? And so this body of work is a series that I draw from the pages from a collection that I gathered of all of the photographs of Syria in Time magazine. This is my binder of images. I've been collecting images of Syria, every single photograph of Syria in Time magazine since 2011, March of 2011 being the beginning of what was then deemed the Arab uprisings, and then eventually civil war and proxy wars. So from those images, I pulled the ones that, for this particular series, I pulled ones that, somebody's audio is on and making noise, sorry. So I pulled images that used light in an interesting way. So here being a very dark kind of night time, and then with a flash or ambient light hitting the faces. And the way that I'm thinking about this project is that if we are to look at these images, then again, how would be the ethical way to do so. And I started to think that then the onus would have to be on the viewer, and that actually the intervention would not, in this case, as in the previous works where the intervention was directly into the pages, here I'm keeping the pages fully intact and using the space between the page and the viewer as the place for intervention. And so here the pages are actually mounted to the back of carved glass. And the carvings make it so that one would have to move their body and occupy the physical space and construct one's own choreography of viewership that's different than the typical viewer experience when we're going forward and backward, or in the case of the magazine where we're turning the page, right? And so in this case, I'm asking the viewer to do a dance, and that's not necessarily, you know, choreographed by me, but whatever is inherent to the practice of viewership of each individual. And so here that one could move back and forth to see an image. And so I just wanted to speak briefly as well about the way that the carvings are, where the lines are decided, because they're not arbitrary. So I'm drawing on a principle of organizing two-dimensional space that is used in architecture and in painting, actually. And we don't study it very much anymore, but I think that it's informed the way we construct images. So I think it's useful, and it's almost become kind of known without having a name. And so this particular mode of construction is actually called dynamic symmetry. So if you think about typical symmetry is the horizontal and the vertical lines, where the vertical line here is represented by the where the magazine is folded and stapled, which I leave visible. But dynamic symmetry is one that's actually based on the diagonal. And by creating, we maintain our right angles that we would find in the vertical and horizontal lines typically. But in this case, it's tilted so that it's the diagonal and then the line that intersects, I'm going to use my cursor here, at another angle, at an opposite angle, and then going down to 90 degrees. And so these lines can be, there's multiple, so every diagonal has two reciprocals is what they're called, and then there's two diagonals, and these have their own reciprocals, and that by choosing and making strategic decisions of which ones to pull, we can actually begin to see the way images are constructed and their levels of importance in our experience that the magazine is actually trying to construct. And so here we have, again, I'm going to use my cursor, is where the lines intersect. here I'm pulling all of the 4 reciprocals and eliminating the diagonals. Where they all intersect is the central figure here, a girl who is named a young survivor, but her name is never actually given. Whereas the name of the photographer is. And so I'm thinking about things like this and how the magazine is constructing these narratives by actually formally constructing the space so that it's quickly recognizable. So here we have the primary kind of subject where everything is, where the lines are intersecting. These areas that are individual lines, I think of that as the context for the subject, in this case being the back of a van, and we begin to see certain details like the windows and the backs of the seats, etc. And then here where we have these edges here, I think of those as peripheral information that is used, and they typically, you'll find that they tend to be swaths of like contentless swaths, or mostly just completely black in a lot of instances. And this is, I imagine, intended literally to draw the viewer to the center here. And so what is happening by overlaying this, the glass on top of it, is that it's actually reversing the way the magazine wants the images to be read, which is the places of rest and the simplest places to view are actually somewhat contentless. And the place where the subject is the most distorted and is asking the most of the viewer for access and connection. And the hope here is that that connection might actually be deepened or actually even opened up through this choreography that a viewer might have to construct on their own. So, and then lastly, I just want to point to this, you know, this particular diptych that I began after a while to be able to bring in, instead of looking at single pages or 2-page photographs, to actually expand it into the rest of the article as well, and to see if we could carry some of these thoughts that here, you know, you have again a reciprocal and a diagonal, and simply between these 2 lines one can see the entirety of the content, the so-called content of the image, falling between this and the line of this boat actually corresponding perfectly with the diagonal. Again, these are not my decisions, but overlaying dynamic symmetry onto this is revealing things that are happening, constructions that are being deployed to choreograph actually the active viewership and the eye and the cognitive experience. So to carry some of those ideas into the following pages of the same article and expand the philosophy and the construction beyond just the 2-page spread into the full page image or the full article. So in this case, the diagonal going across 4 pages, actually bringing together 2 different photographs. And so we can begin to actually think about the way that the content is meeting the viewer, and we can kind of bring together the construction this way of the magazine and this intervention in the, you know, the active viewership, and that might actually, that collision might actually lend a new type of viewing experience, and therefore connection to the subjects, connection to the information, and connection to the larger story. And so I will end there and pass the buck then to Abigail, and we'll come back and talk about all these, I believe.
Thank you. I'm going to also share the screen. Let's see. Okay, how does that look? Okay, so I'm gonna take off a little bit from where Samira was speaking about this sense of the choreography of the viewer. I think that's something that all 3 of us have been thinking about in terms of these installation elements, and really a show that really asked for a live participation and for people to move through space. But that said, I'm really happy that you all joined on this strange two-dimensional platform to talk about this with us. And I also wanted to thank the incredible staff who hauled around these giant walls with me and gave conceptual advice interchanged with like extraordinary physical strength at all times. And also to thank Samira and Tran for being such great interlocutors, and Steve for being such a thoughtful curator throughout the entirety of this. So I'm going to lead us through a little bit of what it might have been like in that physical choreography. So this entire project is called Out of Play, and it's something I've been working on for 4 years. And there are currently 4 videos. Each of them are about 10 to 15 minutes. There's gonna eventually be 7. And each of these videos focuses on someone who is at the intersection of the US military and the film and television industry. So someone who's caught at the intersection there, and each video then tries to kind of dismantle or poke holes in some of the ways that those two industries have some seamless connections. So trying to reveal some of those seams, sort of in a related way to Samira revealing the seam of the pages. I really want to make space for a viewer to see how those relationships can be pulled apart and we can have a more active viewership. So the first thing that you would encounter in this installation is this. So we have these set walls, and each of these set walls have a video inside of them. So let's see, how do I do this? So this first one, this one we have on the right here, if you enter this space from either side, you would encounter this first video. And so this video focuses on a role player, an Iraqi-American role player who chooses to be anonymous. And we talk for a while about his experience being in this environment at Fort Irwin, which is a US military base in California near Barstow. And he played the role of the police chief. So he was the police chief for 8 years, and we talk about the relationship between role playing and acting, and we talk about the relationship between his memories of his childhood and war in childhood and reenacting them in a way as a role player for this US military base preparing soldiers to go to war in Iraq at the time. So this sense of a childhood reenactment, a childhood PTSD, is one part of the video in relationship to this role playing. And then we also start to see ways in which these towns are constructed. So this is one of the walls, and I also visit the set fabrication shop that creates these structures and also creates sets for film and television. So the video has both of these locations interspersed with interview with this role player. And I also, Chan mentioned this, but our videos are up on the Municipal Gallery website in full. So I really hope that people take a look at those in full. They'll be up through the end of May. So here's another shot from the set fabrication warehouse. So as you leave that space and come around the corner, you encounter this one, which has got these 12-foot gigantic walls. And in that space is the second video. They don't have an order necessarily, but there are 4, and this is sort of how you might guide yourself through space. So this video focuses primarily on my father, who also begins the video by talking about his experience as a child in London in World War II, and talking a little bit about his experience of PTSD. And he then goes on to talk with me about being a method actor and my experience growing up with someone who had different accents at different times and who I believed for a while to be actually in the military because he played a lot of military roles. And so he was in a TV show called JAG that really features throughout this whole project as a kind of touch point for me to think about ways that media and military overlap, specifically in relation to my dad. So he talks about his experience living in character, his experience on these TV shows, and then I ask him to take a court-martial transcript that I've been given, and that's Petra, I don't know if y'all can hear that, and perform it as if it's a script. So there's my mom in the corner holding the cards. 1 second. Hold on, I'm gonna mute my app. Okay, she'll just, she's interrupting. So the performance of this court-martial transcript as a script that he's performing then gets followed up in the next video, which is in this room. So in this room, I introduce 2 new people who are at the intersection of the US military and film and television. And one of them is a scriptwriter for JAG who talks about what was allowed and not allowed to be written about in this TV show. And one of those things is PTSD. It was the main thing that they were not allowed to write about. And there's this sort of, I don't want to say subtle, but you in watching, and I have watched now all of the entirety of JAG, you wouldn't necessarily notice that. So there are these omissions, these kind of gaps in information that are very powerful. It's very powerful to not have people be able to think about PTSD when they're thinking about the military. In this kind of benign TV show, these gaps become very potent. And so that's one person that I speak to. And the other person I speak to is the head of redactions for the US Army, who provides me with court-martial transcripts that are then used for film and television. So in this one, we have maybe a little bit more of an experimental approach. With each of these, I call them experimental documentary shorts that investigate the ways that these redacted parts of the US military's actions get filled in by film and television to form these kind of seamless narratives. And again, I'm trying to pull them apart to give us some space to see those constructions. And then in the last one, so here's some of that redacted court-martial transcript. And then I'm asking my dad to deal with the redactions. So in the other one, he had no redactions. And now I'm asking him, what do you do as an actor? And how do you react to these gaps? And the last one is this video that transitions from film and television more into news. And so I'm talking here with a former combat videographer named Oscar, who then became a camera person for news. But as a combat videographer in Desert Storm, he didn't necessarily know what he was shooting for, but documenting a lot of Desert Storm and then handing off his tapes. So I went through a process of finding these tapes and uncovering this long trail of research around the relationship between these combat videographers and the news. So sort of in relationship to this idea of looking back at the longer history of how media has been militarized, the US military had a huge backlash after the US war in Vietnam around the freedom of journalists to really influence the US approval of wars. And so they started to train their own combat videographers and started to create this thing called, which you can see there, the US pool tape. So they would have combat videographers put their footage into this pool along with journalists, and the US military would say what's approved and what's not approved to be used in the news. And so we talk about these things, we're pulling them apart, and to be totally honest, this is maybe one where I'm like, there's more for me to work with here. There's more that sort of unfolded. So this leads me to the next 3 that I haven't finished yet, but this is going to be worked on a little bit more as well, because this research just keeps unfolding, and I'm cutting myself off at 7 episodes, but it is a cutoff because the many ways in which these 2 industries are connected is it's really like a network rather than a linear direction in this research. It really is like an overlapping network. And that is part of the reason that it was important to me to have these physical installations so that you could go in and walk around and see them in any order and make these connections yourself, have some agency in terms of putting these parts together and seeing this network in an embodied way. And so this conversation, I think, is really especially exciting to me in that understanding of a network of ideas, to be in conversation with Tran and with Samira about the ways that we're all doing this work of maybe making more space for a viewer to have some agency in relation to these images or video of war. Yeah, I'm really excited to have this dialogue with some Q&A and with the other artists. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Abigail, Samira, and Tran. So we're going to open it up to a Q&A section. So if anyone has any questions they would like to ask the artists, if you could just please use the chat section and I'll read off the questions. And if no one has any immediate questions, I do have a few questions for the artists. So maybe I'll start there, and then as people are entering in their questions, again, please use the chat section to address those questions, and I will read them out as I see them. So my question for Tran, Abigail, and Samira, you all each talked to some degree about how each of your works and installations in the show lean heavily on 3D presence. So I'm wondering if you can each speak to what it's been like to, as we shifted more to 2D or flat screens during this era of COVID-19 and social distancing.
Jan, do you want to take this one?
Yes, sorry, I had to unmute myself. So, I mean, I think speaking about my work in particular, the advantages is, of course, it's more accessible to all of you, right? And the opportunity for people far away to be able to see the work, even though it's a simulated 3 video kind of scenario. I mean, I think what's lost is clearly you can't see the physical screens themselves and move through the space. This installation has 6 channels of audio. So as your body moves across the 3 screens and across the space, the audio shifts with you, not in an interactive way, but you'll be able to hear something louder if you're in a particular spot in the installation as opposed to another spot. So that's also lost. And so the sound was, you know, designed by the talented Mylene Colbert and expertly mixed by Aaron Drake. And that is just not available. I mean, you can hear all of the 6 channels smushed together in a 2-channel situation on Vimeo, but that's, you know, that's also lost. At the same time, you know, I'm happy that it's out to a wider world. So that's what's gain and loss for me.
I think I spoke a little bit about the relationship to having like a physical embodied sense of agency with these kinds of images. And so for me, that's a little bit lost. But again, I totally agree with Chan of this idea that, you know, so many more people get to see it in this format. And that for me is really important as I'm thinking about this idea of, I call each of these episodes, and thinking about the movement of this work in living rooms. I think a lot about how we consume media in our home spaces. And so this is really heightening that, making that a constant. That's the only way we're consuming media right now. So for me, there is a push and pull where there is some interest for me in this becoming much more of a 2D experience. But I had a very interesting discussion with a student, sorry, Petra's having feelings again, with a student at Cal Arts who was creating a work that was about both the mundane experience of being in the home all the time and this screen as a portal to all of the sort of violence outside. And thinking about the screen as its own thickness. So I've been trying to anchor myself in thinking that this isn't just this magical window into another world, because there's an intensity, that's a different topic, but just to think about the thickness of the screen, to think about this as also another physical medium, that we are encountering a physical surface that is, even if it's a 1/4 inch thick, it's not nothing. And that's sort of been helpful for me in thinking about this new way that we're interacting with these works.
Great, thank you.
I echo some of the same ideas, and there's a particular irony for me where I'm trying to actually create a dynamic experience of a flattened image, right? Where there's photography is itself an act of sort of flattening and suspending a dynamic world into a frame, into a moment that we choose to access, but that we can call up anytime we want in, you know, some way, shape, or form. And that, I'm trying to kind of intervene on that flatness and expand it back and bring dynamism and criticality back into the experience of viewership and into the frame itself. And to have that, foreclosed on is definitely a challenge, but that's why I relish these conversations. And I've always thought that conversation around the work is fundamental to the work itself, the work and the practice of critical viewership, and that the real work for me is realized and exists in the moment where another person is at the dentist's office and sort of opens the Time magazine and has like a new, the image or the magazine itself kind of pings for the reader and the viewer. And then that's where the work lives, is in that kind of the actual dynamic experience where the magazine or the image then would surprise the viewer, and they would have to reconcile it with this new knowledge. And it doesn't happen for everyone. I just kind of put it into the world and trust that, some will take it and work with it. So I'll just say that much, but I feel like there's some questions coming up, so maybe we'll give that some time.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm not sure if Steve he might have stepped away, but there is a question for him, so we'll skip over that for right now. So I'll just read the questions as they came through. So skipping Steve's question, there's a question for you, Samira, about how you feel this pandemic situation has affected the aura of your work.
Yeah. Hi, Ariana. Thank you for the question. I think it's, I think that's sort of what I was speaking to at that moment, was that that one would sacrifice the aura, the singular object that one would confront. But the interesting thing for me about the printed magazine and digital images as well, but I'm interested in the materiality in this particular case, is a multiple itself. And so we're dealing with a single experience or event that's then photographed and made kind of static, but then printed in, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands and distributed, you know, and lands on the doorsteps of thousands of people every Friday and sits in newsstands. And so already the, that kind of the aura of the single thing is already complicated and made more complex by the nature of the magazine distribution, and then taking it and adding aura back in with the handmade object. And the idea here is always for me to put the sort of it's the lived experience of aura back into the image that we don't expect it from. And that's sort of why all the work is handmade and the glass is hand cut. And that's really important because that knowledge actually affects the reading. And so I do try to depend on that. I have not figured out how to do it in representation again. And I think it's a really interesting challenge to add another layer of flattening. And I think that Abigail and Tran have a similar kind of spatial problem of taking flat images, making them dimensional, making them, you know, in that one would actually have to move their body in relation to it, and that kind of making those critical decisions based on their experience, and then to have that kind of foreclosed on again or truncated in some way is an interesting challenge because it is fundamentally what we are dealing with, and it is the subject of the work in addition to the formal qualities is this flattening. And so the flattening of information, the flattening of access, the flattening of content, the flattening of emotional commitment and investment, the flattening of aura, the flattening of light. You know, these things are really fundamental to the material that we're culling from. And so to have this moment kind of impose itself on our assumptions as practitioners and the things we've taken for granted as makers is really an interesting experience, and it's a challenge, and I don't, it is absolutely not resolved, and it has never been resolved for me, and I highly doubt for any of us. And I think if one feels that it is resolved, you're probably not working hard enough. So I'll pass it to anyone else that wants to speak to that.
I don't have any specific thoughts on aura. Chan?
Getting him on mute. No, not particularly on aura, but I did think about how the content addresses motion studies. So it would have been really lovely to sort of enact that in the physical space itself, right? Like encouraging and guiding the viewers' bodies to move through space as to mimic the content that they're viewing as well. And I think for Abigail, I see sort of the loss of the walls as a framing structure, right? Like there's, of course, you can see the videos online, but there is something much more that's gained within the framed walls themselves that you understand and put your physical body in a particular space that is also addressed in the content. So I think form and content is, again, you know, deftly at play here, and that half of that is missing with an online video.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And there's a sense, as Samira was talking about that, I was wondering if, because we're engaging with time, with this another element of time that you're not engaging with in the same way, Samira, that there's a sense that some of that, I'm not sure, I have to think through this for longer, I won't be able to articulate it right now, but some of this relationship between cohabitating in a temporal existence with the videos gives some of that aura, like makes some of that aura possible. But then as you're saying, Chan, these walls were really important to me, partially because they're huge. I wasn't working with these enormous walls for fun necessarily. The enormity of their presence was really important to me to deal with the enormity of a lived impact that these seemingly benign TV shows or films that are for entertainment really do have this enormous lived monolithic impact. And so that is something that's really lost, is the scale, but also they came straight from the set fabrication. There are walls that were given back. There are walls that were going to be thrown away. There are walls that were maybe used at Fort Irwin, maybe used in film and television, and the dirt was still on them, whether they had been, you know, hit by something. All of those traces of having this other sense of temporality that's not in the sense the video's temporality, but a different one of, and having presence with those experiences that the walls have endured, that is definitely, yeah, that's lost. On an optimistic note.
Great, thank you all. So there are a couple more questions for you.
I have a question. What is video burn?
That was the question I was going to get.
Oh, media burn. What is media
Hey,
burn?
everybody. No, you know, like I've heard that term used a long time ago and stuff. The way that I interpret it is just basically like how, you know, people, you know, reinterpret, you know, different forms of mass media, you know, to basically like draw alternative kinds of meaning, you know, out of them and, you know, what have you. So I think that one of the things that really intrigued me, besides the scale, you know, of each of your settings, was in the way that, you know, that different forms of media, whether or not it's, you know, the reclaimed, you know, television footage or movie footage, you know, or industrial, you know, material, or even the way in which, you know, printed matter, you know, is reinterpreted by you. I think that it, you know, it's an alternate way of looking at how, you know, we regard, you know, the way that you know, we, and I'm, you know, talking in terms of either people of color or other folks, you know, are seen in different forms of media and stuff. I don't know if that's, you know, like a, you know, like a particularly accurate or articulate way of looking at it, but I don't know, maybe it's because it's like a 90s term or what have you, and it's kind of like fallen, you know, out of like, you know, our, you know, intellectual lexicon or what have you. But, you know, but I think that, you know, that was one aspect of each of your works that I was like really struck with while viewing each of them at the gallery.
Yeah, if I could just jump in and respond to that. I mean, I think, you know, maybe not the specific use of the term media burn, but definitely a critical view and usage of the media that we're reclaiming, if you will, or appropriating. And I think definitely in my project, I was with an eye to media sources that would have not been widely seen at all, right? Like whether it's archival footage. And I think this also touched on something that the three of us have also discussed previously in terms of gaps in information. And I think in particular for me, the footage of the striking workers in South Carolina, could not find any moving image of that at all for the life of me. And so then had to resort to animating the still images that I was able to find. So I think it's in tandem with the critical perspective of looking at the media. There's also this desire to fill in gaps of information as well. And I know, Abigail, you've thought a lot about this. So do you want to jump into?
Yeah, I think that I actually have, I think it's been really exciting for me to think about your relationship to dealing with gaps in information, which has felt very different from my way of dealing with it. And it's been really productive for me to think about that way that you've taken this kind of playful agency in creating animation or creating ways for us to look at information that just wasn't there. And I think that my relationship to gaps in information has always, not always, but it's been a very long pull, like a real magnetism to dealing with how to present absences and how to make space for gaps in information without filling them in. And so that has been a huge part of this project, of how to look at all of these different redacted documents, all of the ways in which a lot of US military actions are not accessible to us. We don't know how they happened, and that information gets filled in so quickly. And I want to pause in between those. Like, I want to say, like, an example was Zero Dark 30, with the film that was about the killing of Osama bin Laden. All of that information about how Osama bin Laden was killed is totally classified. We have no idea. But a Hollywood film came in, and Catherine Bigelow collaborated with the CIA to create this film. A Hollywood film came in and gave us this narrative that I can't take out of my brain. I can't feel that I don't already have an image that was filled in. That gap was filled in so fast. So I want to pull those things apart a little and give myself some space to be with not knowing, to be with the gap, to make space for the lack of information that I have. And I think it's interesting to think about Samira's relationship to this in this work, specifically to also slowing us down and not letting these images kind of supplant a cultural imagination without asking us to pause and ask what we don't know about how the image was constructed, what we don't know about all of the other factors that went into creating this cultural imagination. That we just like kind of mainline, like it just happened so fast. So it's been really great to think about that kind of those gaps in information in new ways with each of your work.
You likewise. Yeah, I want to leave time for other questions because I could definitely echo some of the thoughts, but I don't know if Jamie, you want to.
Yeah, I think that Steve addressed the question about which specific readings he was inspired by from the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, which he said were being peace and also peace is every step. So I don't know if you three have any other readings that you were inspired by, or if those were more or less the same readings that you took into account for making or creating the work for this show.
I'll speak to this. I do think that the Thich Nhat Hanh text actually has made a very big and welcome impression on me, and I've even I brought it into teaching as well, because I think that I found it to be a relevant text to semiotics in general. This idea of bringing the past into the present in many ways. So to speak to the notion of interbeing, just as a brief kind of overview of how it works is, or how what the philosophy is pointing to is the idea that the flower, in this case, we're calling it the plastic flower, but Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about an actual natural flower, and that the idea that to touch this flower would be to touch all of the things that go into making it, the sun, the water, the earth, the entirety of the history of the universe that manifests itself into this one thing that springs from the earth, and that without any one of these things, that the flower would not exist. And so that to touch the thing is to actually touch the universe and to touch the entire history of the universe in many ways. And here, this idea that viewership and the plastic flower, then the thing that is made, that is constructed, as opposed to the thing that is springing forth and from the earth. And in this case, I've been thinking about, for me, the thing that really resonated was this notion that if we hold the notion of interbeing in our hearts and our bodies and our minds on a daily basis in our lived experiences, whether it be viewership or any other aspect of our lives, I think that the teaching compels us to also see not just being as interconnected, but action as well, and that interaction becomes paramount here. So that one could think that if you were to pluck one atom from the universe, that maybe the flower might not exist or would not exist. And to think that a small gesture like that of intervening on the act of viewership, for example, making the flat thing spatial, making the thing the fixed light dynamic, again, that something like that on a very simple level, the making of it, the viewing of it, would itself be an interconnected action onto the world, and that it could that it will then be contained in everything that comes after. And so what we're compelled to do is to be very thoughtful and very critical about the way that we're engaging and acting in the world, beyond just the practice of making art or anything, that actually, from love and kindness to anger to war to to touching to feeling to looking, right, all of these parts of the lived experience would actually be, because it's interconnected, that we are actually imposing our actions onto the universe in many ways, and that should be done thoughtfully. And so I'm holding this teaching very very close to my heart in life and in the studio.
Yeah, thanks for that, Samira. And I think what Stephen said at the intro too speaks to our time, right? If it seems like commonplace realization through this pandemic is that we're all interconnected, and not just across humans, but as you were saying, Samira, about with the animal kingdom and the plant life as well. Everything is and now the virus, right? It's sort of like that seems to know us better than we know it or ourselves. And yeah, it's just really an amazing time, and to like, even in our isolation, even as we're atomized, to sort of feel how much we're interdependent across space and time and being.
If I could bounce back off of that just for a minute, this one of the things that was troubling to me for transitioning to teaching, for example, in this way, made me have to think very deeply about this, and also just in general moving through space, or not being able to actually move through space, because that was an ethical decision, that the choosing to not participate would actually be an ethical choice. In this case, the thing that's troubling to me and is very dangerous is this notion that touch and being with one another would be seen as negative in some way, and actually part of the transmission actually of a virus, an insidious thing that could actually kill the body and or be destructive to it or dangerous in some way. And that the notion of, I'm afraid for the notion of touch and connection to actually be sort of infected, to use its own, the moment's own language, via transmission. And it's really important to me to make sure that being and touching and acting and connecting maintains its actual kind of its power and its presence through the teaching of Thich Nhat Hanh, who reminds us that that this is not a point of transmission of, viral kind of danger, but it's actually, no matter what it is, it's a connection to the universe, and to the history of the universe, and it's the future as well.
Before I move on, can I just jump back to the gaps in information discussion that Abigail was having? And I think just to throw out credit to artists like Walid Rod and the Atlas Group for having done similar works in speculative nonfiction, if you will. So sort of just want to make sure that that got in there.
Yeah, and I was thinking in sort of a relationship between the ideas of interbeing and gaps in information. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to articulate this at the moment, but there is we talked a little bit, Samira and Chan and I, about this sense of an intimacy with people we've never met in a new way, that our actions of choosing not to go outside benefit someone. We had this idea of a grandpa in San Diego that we haven't met, that there's a sense of interbeing with people that we don't know, and there's a sense that that person is I don't know that person, but there's still a real presence to them, and that making I do think that interbeing makes space for even things that people that we really don't know, things that we don't fully understand, to have as much gravity as the things that we do fully understand. And that our interconnection with strangers is just as important as or just as weighty as our interconnection with the closest people in our lives. And the one relation that I wanted to make, which is sort of, this is the part where I don't have all the dots connected, is in relation to what you just said, Chan, about talking about Walid Rod, or the ways that we're interfacing right now, that these, even though I absolutely agree, Samira, it's terrifying to think of like touch having this notion of infection rather than interconnection, there is also a lot of value in the ways that we're not touching right now, and that we're exchanging information, and all of the ripples that are going to happen from this. And it made me think of another person that I wanted to mention, who was Solmaz Sharif, who's a poet and wrote a really incredible essay around redactions and erasure, and that those things that, that we haven't met in person, those things resonate through time and space. And there's a sense that my work couldn't exist without that person's work, couldn't exist without this conversation, couldn't exist. And then on the other side of it, that sense of absence and gaps is that I keep having the overwhelming, I don't have a word for it yet, but we're going to close these screens, in like 20 minutes, and all of you people that we're just sharing space with are going to be gone. I'm not going to get to see you walk out the door. There's this sense that you weren't ever here. And that is just such an intensity that I'm really missing with this notion that Samira is talking about touch, about the incredible importance of the physicality of interbeing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just while you were talking, another resource came to my mind, and that's Laura Mark's The Skin of the Film book. And I think, again, right, like it's sort of like how film visually can convey a sense of touch, but also the book also addresses a number of groups that are without a particular film history. And so they have to fabricate that history, right, construct that history in and of itself, which also kind of relates back to Abe's question about like, well, what do we do with the media sources that we do have? And so we can absolutely play with it, but there's also, so many other groups in the world without that kind of media resource. And so what do they do about it? So just, and again, a combination of touch and media and gaps in information. I think those three are coming together.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a question specifically for you, Chan, about that a very like tactical notion of collaboration
Mhm.
and participation. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes, I saw that about the embroidery and the women in Vietnam. I think for me, it was very key to have the screens, right, take physical shape and physical importance as well. And I think it made a lot of sense to do some kind of needle craft work, and to me, embroidery as sort of a signifier for, you know, decorations for the fancy stuff, right? And so it made a lot of sense to do that for the screen for Versailles. In terms of the women in Vietnam, I mean, really, frankly, they were the only ones who were, first of all, capable and willing to make this life-size embroidery. I shopped all around Los Angeles in the garment district, you know, some Hollywood shops, and none of them would do it. They thought I was crazy, or that it would take a lifetime of labor in order to do something like this. And so I ran into a former student who said, well, yes, my studio in Vietnam works with these women, this team who can hand embroider all of this for you. So let me connect you with that. And they did it at a phenomenal result, and for, dare I say it, a third of the price of anybody else who would have quoted me to do anything like this. So.
Great, thank you. Those were all the questions that we had, unless anyone else has any other questions. No? Thank you so much to Samira, Abigail, and Tran for being with us here today. Although I certainly wish we could have done this at the gallery with your work, but this is really, really amazing. And thank you to everyone too who joined us today. It was great seeing so many familiar faces and new faces. And again, if you haven't had the opportunity to see Abigail and Tran's video works, those are up on the LMAG website through the end of May. We do also have some documentation via the install shots that are some of the background of our Zoom that you can check out. And then there's also digital copies of the gallery guide with an essay by Steve Wong, and a lot of really other great resources. So please check out our website and stay tuned for all sorts of other really great virtual happenings that we're going to be planning on. And as a reminder, we did record this talk, so our hope is to get it up on the LMAG website within the next couple weeks. And all of your comments were so thoughtful and just really great. So I hope you all don't mind. I did save the chat, so we can share that as well. And just thank you all so much. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again soon in person.
Well,
Thank you.
It's really nice to share, if even just a virtual space with everyone.
Yeah.
There is a benefit to not depending on physicality and the institutional structures and that of, you know, like specific location and physicality. So this is kind of the pseudo democratization of access in some way. So there is, it's not entirely a negative thing, and I really appreciate being able to see your faces at this time and connect with people across wherever in the world you are, and that's a really lovely experience.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.